Right, over the course of the next few videos, we're going to go over solving quadratic equations, okay? We're going to use square root method, we're going to use factoring method, we're going to use quadratic formula, and then in a later set of notes, we're going to go over using completing the square to solve quadratics, okay? Anytime you solve quadratics, there's a possibility that you're going to end up with a negative number underneath the radical at some point, okay? And in order to work with that, we're going to have to use I for imaginary numbers, okay? So any solution of a quadratic that has I in it, we're going to call those solutions imaginary, or we're going to call them complex. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about I before we actually get into solving quadratics, okay? So first off, I is recognized as the square root of -1, okay? Up to this point, anytime you had a negative number underneath the radical, you just said that was undefined. We didn't go any further with that, okay? But there are times where we need to actually calculate using that square root of -1, and there are real-world situations where this has many applications, okay? So what does I do? Okay, I allows us to solve problems or equations that have the square root of a negative number, okay? These are used in sound spectrum analyzers, electricity, and many other things, okay? So we need this imaginary number to help us solve problems, okay? Now, inevitably, there's a cycle of I. So if we've got I to the first power, we know that's the square root of -1, okay? So I to the second power would be the square root of -1 times itself. Well, the square root of any number times the square root of that same number is that number, okay? And we learned that when we were rationalizing denominators, okay? So I squared is going to be -1. If we multiply that by the square root of -1, we'd get I cubed, or negative square root of -1. If we were to multiply this by I to the first, that would give us I to the fourth. So it would be the negative square root of -1 times the square root of -1, and that would give us +1, okay? So the cycle of I goes in sets of 4 here. So I to the fifth would be 1 times I to the first, or square root of -1, and then I to the sixth would be the same as I squared, and that pattern continues forever. So I to the seventh would be the same as I cubed. I to the eighth would be the same thing as I to the fourth, and so on, okay? So if you can remember that cycle, that's very helpful down the road. All right, so real quickly, we just want to kind of simplify these values here, where we got a negative number underneath the radical. Before you would have stopped, you would have said, hey, this is undefined. There's nothing I can do there, okay? But now, I can break -9 down to 9 times -1, okay? If you've gotten to this point, you've already simplified radicals, so the ability to do this should be, in you already, okay? So the square root of 9 is 3. The square root of -1 we know to be I. Square root of -1 is I. So when I simplify the square root of -9, I get 3I, okay? With b here, we've got -100 times, -100. We want to take the square root of that. So let's factor that as 100 times -1, and that gives me 10I, okay? And then C, I've got the negative square root of -36, okay? So we're going to factor -36 as 36 times -1, and that gives me -6I, okay? So just a quick introduction to imaginary numbers, and as we're solving quadratics, okay, the rest of this set of notes and the next set of notes, you might have to use I in your solution process, okay?